So when we first come into the world of homesteading, we're gardening, we're growing our own food, and it's really easy to take on a ultra-focused perspective of what we're doing. We focus on the plants, we focus on individual animals, and that's normal. And it's also, I think, a symptom of our industrial conditioning that we can get so reductionist that we fail to see the bigger picture. Now, we've all done it. I've absolutely been there, and I'm still struggling to broaden my thinking. But one thing I've learned over the last few years as I've continued to mature as a homesteader and a gardener and expand my education is that the picture is much, much bigger. Everything's connected, and there's so many other pieces that it's easy to forget. Now, recently, I'd say over the last year or two, soil has become a really big focus of mine. If you've been listening to the show, you know I get totally nerded out over that topic. We've talked about it a number of times. And today we're going to talk about it again because I just can't get enough of it. And I'm starting to realize the more I start to understand what's going on underneath my garden, what's happening broader than just the tomato or the cucumber, things start to get really interesting, and it just feels better. It just feels right. And my yields are better and everything starts to flow. So I'm very excited to have Gregg Forster with me today. He is the owner of Wisconsin Mineral Solutions, and that's a company that helps small family farms help their yields and just make things more fluid and more holistic. So I'm excited to talk to him today about what we can do as home gardeners and homesteaders to boost our soil health and really bring that broader picture conversation into what we're doing in our backyard. So welcome, Gregg.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Yes, I'm excited for this conversation. I feel like I've just barely scratched the soil, Freudian slip, scratched the surface of understanding my soil. And every time I just get another piece of the puzzle, it's just like all the lights come on. So I'm excited today to dive into this.
Yes. Oh. Well, I guess just a quick little bit of background is I have a Bachelor of Science in physics. And originally I was applying that and other training to the world of software engineering. And eventually that kind of got focused on indoor air quality and other indoor environmental issues. And then eventually over into the world of soil and agriculture and looking at what actually is going on in the soil and what the implications of that are. So that's kind of like the foundation of how I think, looking at the physics of things.
That's awesome. I like that. I think that's a good perspective to come into it with. So I'd kind of like to start granular and work our way out, because I think that's where most of us begin. We start focusing on the things that are right in front of us, that are in our kitchens, that are on our cutting boards. So what misconceptions do you see people having around the nutritional value of fresh produce?
That's a great question. A lot of times we look, well, first of all, when I go shopping at a grocery store, which I try not to do too often,
Yep, same.
I try to get most of it from my own homestead. But I tend to go just around the outside perimeter of the store looking at just fresh foods. But just because a vegetable is fresh and doesn't look wilted maybe in a grocery store or even in a farmer's market, it doesn't really speak a whole lot to what the nutritional value of the food is. And so I think there's a misconception that if you get it at a farmer's market or if you get it at a store that sells organic food, that it's going to be really good for you. And there are definitely trade-offs we can make, and I would definitely choose to buy something organic than something that's not. But there have been lots of tests on food that's been grown organically, and they look at the nutrient value in it, and it isn't really that good.
Yes.
And I had a friend who used to do a lot of farm consulting, and he told me one day that if I was going to eat a serving of broccoli and I wanted to get the same amount of nutrition that my great-great-grandparents got, that I would have to eat about 12 servings of broccoli compared to their one. And I thought, well, that's probably true, but I didn't really have any, science that kind of backed that up. And since then, I've seen quite a few different research studies that have shown like dramatic differences in what the nutrient value of food was about 50 years ago compared to today. And some of them, it's not just like, 10 or 20% reduction. It might be like 500 times less of certain nutrients. And so I started kind of looking at that, and that started driving a lot of the passion behind what I'm doing, because there are so many things going on in our society today that I think go back to the fact that we're not eating as good a job as we're trying to do. We're not eating very good food. So just because it looks like a tomato doesn't mean it is really a tomato, from the way it's supposed to be and the way our bodies are supposed to respond to it.
What do you attribute that massive nutrient loss? And I think it's interesting that there are studies there, because I've heard that fact thrown around so much. And I've always been like, can we quantify that? It sounds interesting, and it's a great hook for an article, but like, can we quantify it? Right. What do you attribute that to? Is that just like overuse? Is it commercial fertilizers? Is it not rotation? What do we think is the biggest culprit there?
Right. Well, a little bit of it you alluded to in your book, and looking at how the Industrial Revolution came in and people started doing things differently on their farms than they've been doing for a long, long time. And it largely does come back to the soil and a lot of the things that happen in modern agriculture, and even on our own homesteads a lot of times, just don't treat the soil like the living entity that it is. And we kind of treat it just like dirt, just dirt. But it's not just dirt. And the practices that we've engaged in have caused the quality of that soil to drop over time. And because of that, it can't hold on even to the nutrients that we might add to it.
Yes. So here's a question I've actually wondered, because we like to throw rocks at the commercial produce, right? Oh, it's not as nutritious and it's not as good, blah, blah, blah. But like, if we're not caring for our soil in this more holistic, bigger picture way, it's possible that what we're growing in our home gardens really isn't much better than what we're getting at the grocery store, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So it's easy to point fingers, but maybe we should be looking at what we're doing, because we can be mimicking those practices without realizing it.
Right. And oftentimes even the homestead that you live on, the garden that you have, you probably started with soil that at some point was mismanaged by a farmer. And I'm not blaming farmers. It's like there are so many pressures on a farmer, and it's hard to stay in business these days as a farmer. And a lot of the pressures that they have to produce the most perfect, uniform looking fruits and vegetables, the decisions that they might make to stay in business might be some of the worst decisions they could possibly make for the long-term viability of that farm. And then when we go buy a piece of land that was farmed that way, we're inheriting something that's already very broken as a homesteader. And then how are you going to change it? You might even be doing some pretty smart things on your farm or your homestead, and it's just not working because you started out with a broken piece of land.
Absolutely. When we talk about these nutrient deficiencies, it's easy to go, okay, the peach isn't as peachy as it was, or the tomato isn't as tomatoey as it used to be. And I've often heard older folks talk about how the produce today doesn't taste like what they remember from their childhood. It's even changed so much in just a few decades. And it's hard to quantify that sometimes, but how might we start to see these nutrient deficiencies showing up in the average person's diet? Is there any red flags that maybe some listeners are experiencing they don't realize there?
Sure. Well, I'm absolutely not a doctor, and I don't have any medical advice around any of this. But if you just look at, like, I have a little chart over here I'm going to take a glance at, but one of the B vitamins in snap beans, if you grow it according to the Dr. William Albrecht method for balancing soil, and you really have the vitality of the soil in mind, not just NPK to make things grow, that B vitamin, there is 30 times as much of that B vitamin in there than there is in what most universities today would recommend as the best way to grow snap beans. And if I think about all of the emotional distress that people have in recent decades, and not even just in the last couple of years, but in the last few decades, depression and things like that, what would somebody might recommend that you do to help with that? You're probably going to boost at least your B vitamin intake. Well, if our great-grandparents were eating snap beans that had 30 times the amount of B vitamins in it that I can get if I do the best job I can growing it at home, but not exactly keeping the soil biology and mineral balance in view. That's going to have a huge impact on my health. And the same thing with copper. Copper in snap beans goes from 3 units to 69 units, going back to the older way of doing it. And, so I really like the idea of old-fashioned on purpose, because old-fashioned doesn't mean backwards.
Yes.
It means more like the way that originally the wisdom that we had in how to take care of the soil and management, we're going to carry that on. And if we had been doing that, things like copper and potassium, magnesium, calcium would actually be in the food in levels that are more the way they were designed to be. So if we're, we might have things like anemia, we could have blood sugar problems, we can have fungal issues like with the reduced amount of copper, the zinc levels way down, maybe we're going to have skin issues. There are all kinds of things that are kind of complicated as to, what is the actual source of the problem. It's probably not just that you don't have enough zinc in your diet, but not having enough zinc in the food is definitely going to have an impact on skin health.
Yeah. It really makes me think of just like death by 1,000 cuts. Because
right.
it's hard, because and that's why we ignore it so easily, I think, until our body sends up a huge, warning signal, and then we go to the doctor and they're like, well, here, take this medication. But there's all those little pieces leading up to it that we might not think about. Like, I'm not getting enough B vitamins. I'm not getting enough zinc. I'm not getting enough iron. But it's hard to know why and where and how until it gets to down the road to where it's becoming a big problem.
That's right.
Yeah. You said something a minute ago that hit me. You said, when talking about the soil and the beans and such, it's not just NPK. And I love that, because I think that is our reductionist industrial paradigm, that it is, we can just break it all down into this formulaic, overly simplified view, and we do this, and we're good. And I think most of my listeners know, so much bigger than that. There's so many more pieces than that. And it's almost arrogant of us as humans to think we can just reduce it down to this teeny little formula.
That's right.
We know it's not just NPK, but in your view, what else is going on in the soil, whether it's on the big scale or in our backyard scale, that we need to be thinking about, that we need to be nurturing, like give us that bird's eye view?
Sure. Well, there's a diagram that you can find lots of places. You can find it on the internet. It's kind of just generically referred to as the mineral wheel. And it's a circle, and all around the edge of the circle are listed different minerals. You see the calcium and the zinc and some of the rare earth metals on there. And there's a line that, like if you just started with calcium, there's a line that goes to about the 20 different minerals that it depends on, that it interacts with, it maybe needs in order to do its job. And there are lots of lines. And if you just step back and look at it from a bird's eye view, the whole thing is just covered with lines. And so for me to even say something like reduced copper in your diet might make you susceptible to fungal issues is kind of ridiculous, because it actually has so many other nutrients that are required for it even to do its job. So I think the complexity there is something to keep in mind. And we have to have an overall balance in mind for the soil. And we couldn't just add a bunch of copper and solve a problem. Even like if we have fungal issues on our tomatoes, maybe you might want to buy a spray, a antifungal spray, that has copper in it. But is that really the answer? Most treatments like that are not, I won't say too late, but it's not preventative. So what if we had the right amount of copper in the soil and it was in balance, that we have enough zinc that the phosphorus can be utilized appropriately in the plant. So the plant is just healthy from the start. And when pathogens land on the plant, they hardly do any damage at all. And what if we had enough boron and calcium in the soil that the rest of the nutrients could come up, and we could have really flavorful, sweet tomatoes. And the plant itself has higher levels of sugars in it. So when pests do land on it and take a bite or two, they just realize, oh, I can't really digest this very well. And so they fly off to someplace else where they have deficient soils and weak plants.
I'm so intrigued by that conversation around the pests, because that's a huge question I get. Any blog post I've ever written about how to naturally deal with pests is always viral in the summer. And there's so many, and I posted them, recipes for cayenne pepper spray and soap spray and all this. Yeah. And they work to a point, but then they just don't. So I've always been like, there's got to be something else. And I'm so intrigued by this idea that when we get the plants and the soil balanced, that they're actually going to ward off pests on their own more than just,
Right. And sometimes it's even things that we're trying to do, and we're trying to do a good job and make sure that the fertility is good in the soil. And an example is I saw one farmer that he took me out to his garden, and he wanted to know what was going on with his potato plants. And he had 6 rows of potatoes, and they were planted fairly close together. And so the vines were kind of overlapping each other from row to row. And one section was just covered with potato bugs, and the other had almost zero. And I found out that the side that was very, very in trouble with the potato bugs, they had mulched it. And they had mulched it with, it was basically horse manure. Okay. And there weren't any weeds there. There were weeds on the other side, but there were almost zero bugs on the side without the mulch. And what was going on there is that he tried to do a good thing, and he did the mulching, and it was with a very nitrogen-rich source. And the plants just ended up pulling up too much nitrogen. Mm-hmm. And plants that have too much nitrogen are pretty weak. And they send off signals to the pests like, I'm not in good shape, just get rid of me. And I think that's kind of generally what's going on with plants that are having a lot of trouble with pests, is maybe those are plants that we shouldn't be eating them anyway, because there's something wrong with them. And they're giving off signals to the pest, wipe me out. Don't go over to the good tomato or potatoes right next to me. Yeah. So that was a really stark example when I saw that.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, there were
even done that. I have over nitrogened. And I have seen it happen. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Hey friends, so I'm interrupting this episode for just a second to talk about something that I actually used to be really embarrassed about. So much so that I never talked about it publicly. And that is the fact that every summer I would basically completely fall out of love with cooking. So much so that I just didn't want to do it anymore. And I was thinking that I was the only one who felt like that until recently, when I started to share my deep, dark secret online. And I found out that many, many of you feel the same way. I think it's just because we have so much going on in the summers that it's just really hard to find that motivation to get in the kitchen and put food on the table. The problem is, our people, well, they still want to eat. Unfortunately. So we still have to find ways to nourish them and ourselves in a cost-effective and healthy way. So I've been wrestling with this problem in my own life, and, for those of you, for many years now, trying different things, experimenting with different ideas. And I finally have created something that I think may just help. I know it has helped me. It's called Mealcraft, and it's not your typical meal planning system. Rather, it's a set of customizable frameworks that are endlessly flexible based on what you have in your gardens, your pantries, your freezers, your larders. You don't have to go to the grocery store to do specific shopping trips or anything like that. We're just using what you have, which really is what homesteading is all about. So Mealcraft gives you 4 new frameworks each month. And I'm personally having so much fun with these because they can be different every time, saves me a lot of money. It's reducing the leftovers and the waste that's coming out of my kitchen, and it just makes it a lot more enjoyable. So if you'd like to join us over in Mealcraft, over 600 of you have already joined the fun. You can visit the link in the show notes to learn more. Now, back to our episode. No, it's not the same. But Okay, so they're listening. They're like, I want this. I want this. Where do they start? Let's say someone has a backyard garden. They're not sure what's going on out there. Maybe there's stuff that's not growing as well from year to year as they'd like. Where do they start the diagnosing? And then how do they start taking action to bring this into balance?
Right. That's very important. And again, since I have a science background, I like the idea of testing. And so soil testing is usually where I begin for anybody. And you can get really inexpensive tests that don't really help a whole lot. And you can get really expensive tests that you don't really need to be paying that much for. But just a standard soil test that does cover the trace minerals is really important to kind of get started. And they're not too expensive, depending on which labs you use. It could be anywhere from like $25 to $45. And that'll give you a good perspective of what's going on. It'll even help you understand, based on a few of the minerals, how the biology in the soil is doing. And some people really kind of push back against the idea of testing the soil. And I'm not sure why, because it doesn't seem really like it's a price issue. But a lot of people like to do what they do on their garden because that's just the way they've always done it. And that's the way maybe their parents did it or their grandparents did it. And sometimes that can work out fine, but you don't really know what's going on unless you test it and take a look. And one example that I see a lot of times is people like to put calcium on the soil. They're putting gypsum on or high calcium lime. And there's the old adage that calcium is king. And it's true. Calcium is really, really important for helping get other nutrients mobilized up into the plant, and it has so many functions on its own. But if you keep adding it and keep adding it and keep adding it, and that's just what we do every year, you might experience some really good results for, maybe 10 years. And then all of a sudden you can't figure out why nothing is working in your garden. And for calcium in particular, Dr. William Albrecht said it should be about 68% of the cations in the soil. And if you were low and you started adding calcium and you got it closer and closer to that 68%, you'd be doing so much better than you were in previous years. And then when you get a little bit above 68%, you might really not notice any improvements. You don't notice any problems either. And then eventually maybe it gets up into the low 70% and things aren't working quite as well. And the calcium tends to cause the soil colloids to open up so that you have more air percolation, water absorption, more opportunity for soil biology to live, and it's fantastic. But if you get too much calcium in the soil, then all of a sudden these vertical platelets collapse on top of themselves. And now how are you going to get the soil to open back up? You can't add more calcium to do it. And so it can be a lot harder to fix an overabundance of minerals than a deficiency of minerals. And so making sure that we're not overdoing it and we're looking at actually the balance that's there and making numerical decisions on how much to put on is really important. So that's what I usually recommend as the first place to start. Let's do a soil test and then get some good recommendations on what direction you should go.
Okay. And I would like to give a shout out for those listening. I have used the Redmond soil test kits in the past. You guys have heard me talk about that. We can put a link in the show notes, and they're good. Like, they give the trace minerals. They give, I think, enough information without being overwhelming. Those are useful. They're like $30, $35. So just shout out to them, and you mail it in. So they've been pretty good. I've been impressed with them. Okay. So you got your soil tested, and I think it's a great point you made about too much. You can't have too much of a good thing. I've danced on that line and I've been like, more is not always better. Right. So I think that's good to know, because I think we have that tendency. I'm always like, oh, more. Okay. So number one, we test, and then what? What do? We get the results and we're like, okay, I have my results now. How do I do?
So then the next thing to do is to add soil amendments that will bring things into balance. And I tend to kind of like when you want whole foods, kind of whole food supplements maybe, or just eating foods that are rich in nutrients. That's the best way for us to get our nutrients in this complex way where all these different things work together. That's usually how the soil works best too. If we don't just add copper, and we're not just going to add zinc, we're not just going to add sulfur, but if there are ways to get different products that have a lot of those in them naturally, usually mined products that you can purchase will help get things into balance a lot better and a lot quicker. Sometimes it's helpful to explicitly add soil biology to the ground. Sometimes all you have to do is stimulate it to flourish. Okay. And because
how would you stimulate it? What would be your steps there?
One of the things you can do is cover cropping. When you grow cover crops, that especially if you use a diverse mix of seeds, that can help a lot. Because things are, like you mentioned, an awful lot more sophisticated and complex under our feet than we tend to think. And when you have a plant growing, one of the things that it does is not just pull things up from the ground for it to grow, but it's actually putting nutrients back into the soil that the microbes need to live. And each plant is going to have a little different profile of how it feeds the microbes beneath it. And so if you have a variety of plants growing, if you have cover crops or you do any kind of interplanting, things like that, then you are putting a more diverse mix of nutrients back into the soil. And then you're going to be able to kind of like ranch microbes in a way that's much more diverse. And then those microbes are going to be able to bring the nutrients into plant assimilable form much more readily. So I think cover cropping is one way to do that. Interplanting, kind of just keeping diversity in mind. And then there are products that you can buy. There's one that we recommend a lot out of the state of Mississippi that is really good. It just has a lot of natural probiotics and soil biology in it right out of the ground where they mine it. There are other products that do that too.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say is it's less, you can take the route of you get the soil test and you're low on iron, so you go find iron and put it in the soil. Or you can, which I honestly lean towards this latter option of finding something that's a little more of a package, whether it's cover crops or intercropping or an additive that has multiple pieces, just to kind of honor the complexity that's already there. Because honestly, right. I get intimidated when I have done the soil test and it's like low on boron or low on iron. I'm like, okay, but how much do I add? And I don't know enough about what's going on to know, am I going to throw this off balance? Or is this other nutrient off balance? So do you recommend going with one of those kind of bigger picture solutions versus getting super granular? How do you help people sort through the best option there?
Yeah, generally I do. There are some nutrients that are just, let's see how to say this. Phosphorus, for example. A lot of times, if you look at any soil across the United States, it probably has about 20,000 pounds of phosphorus per acre. But what we want to find is 600 pounds generally, but you've got 20,000 there. But when you look on the soil test, it might say that you have 100 pounds, not 600 pounds that you need. Okay. And so you might just have to add phosphorus, or you might have to add calcium because there isn't a way to get that in just one big natural product, like a clay or something. But if we can stimulate the soil biology well enough, you might not ever have to add phosphorus because, like I said, you have maybe 20,000 pounds of it per acre in the soil, but it needs the soil biology to convert that into a form that the plants can use, to make it available. And so one way to add nutrients to the soil is to just wake up the biology in the soil so it can start releasing stuff that's already there for us. So kind of keeping the soil structure in mind too. I mentioned that the calcium tends to open up the soil so that there's more air space and the aerobic biology can function well there. But there are things that we can accidentally do that can really get in the way of that too. Like in the spring, we might get really excited to get out in the garden and get things going, but it's too wet. And so even just walking out there, or in a bigger setting, if you get a tractor out there or horses out there, you can compact that soil so that the air spaces get kind of squished out. And now the aerobic bacteria has a really hard time functioning. And then now we have nutrient problems. And a mistake like that can actually cost a person for 3 or 4 years to recover from just going out when it's too wet.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. So there's a lot of pieces here, as there should be, because this is a complex system. That's the beauty of it. Just to help simplify it for my people, they're working towards this. What are there? Maybe there's not. Maybe they're all equally important. What are the big ones to focus on? Is there any that you can say, okay, if you see this on your soil test, or you start to see, or maybe we start with this, what might they see in their garden that would be a red flag when they're watching their plants or they're watching their soil, that even if they don't have a soil test yet, they could go ding, 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 I need to start doing something differently?
Right. Well, I guess 2 big red flags are pest issues and fungal issues. And both of those are signs that the plant is not healthy. And if a plant is not healthy, it's because the soil is not healthy. I mean, certainly you can have, rain damage and hail damage and things like that. But a plant generally is going to be healthy if it's growing on healthy soil. And so if we see a lot of pest issues, that really is a sign that those plants are not able to bring up the minerals that they need, and that it's not able to develop the sugars that it should be able to build, because it doesn't have the basic building blocks that are necessary for that. And so, I mean, gardening can be a lot of fun, and it can also be very discouraging and disheartening. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I remember early on with my garden, before I learned some of these things, it was so frustrating to go out there and fungal issues are setting in early in the season. I'm like, I barely got going yet. My plants are already dying. Yeah. Or later in the season, and you start to see the leaves starting to wilt on your squash plant, and you look and there are all these bugs just devouring away. And it doesn't have to be that way. They're always there. But if we can make it so that overall the soil is robust enough that the plants just thrive, then a lot of the headaches just start to back off.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, okay. So I love that answer. We're looking, so, I mean, there's lots of red flags, but like you said, pest and fungal could be some big ones. And so we have that information, or maybe we have the soil test with a lot of information for us. Are there any points in particular that you would recommend folks focusing on first? That would be like the biggies, to really get into order or equilibrium before they work on all the other parts.
Right. Well, I think you have a chapter in your book called "Tread Lightly on the Soil" or something like that, or "Tread Lightly on the Earth." And I think that is kind of like a fundamental backdrop to all of this, is that we have to realize that this is something that we have to actually take care of, and we have to manage or care for the soil, and realize that it actually does need our help. And organic matter in the soil is something that every time we rototill, every time we plow, every time we disturb the soil, there can be great value in doing that. And there's a lot of debate on whether you should till or no till and all of that. But there is value, I think, in that. But we have to remember that whenever we disturb that soil, we're actually losing carbon. We're losing organic matter. And in order for the soil to be healthy, it has to have enough organic matter to hold on to whatever nutrients we might give it. And even if you're doing cover crops and you're turning that back under and you're adding nutrients that way, if there isn't enough organic matter there already, a lot of that just kind of leaves. It doesn't stay up there for us, for our plants to use. So I guess that would be one of the top priorities in my mind, is building organic matter.
And for those who are like, sounds nice, what is it and how do I do that? What would be your best recommendations there?
Right. So cover crops, again, is a good idea.
Love cover crops.
And I've seen a lot of extra good results when people have a cover crop and they don't let it grow real tall. And then right before they plow it under, they will put some type of manure on.
Yeah.
So it's going in at the same time as there's manure with a lot of biology, and that just kind of has a good synergistic effect in breaking things down more quickly. Because sometimes actually, if you go to a garden or even like a cornfield and it gets plowed up and you look and you see corn stalks in the ground that have been there for 3 years, it's like there shouldn't be anything left of that corn stalk after 1 year.
Yeah.
And so that's actually another good indicator for like a red flag if people are working their soil and they see plant material that's in the dirt from the year before and it's not been broken down yet.
Okay.
There's not enough soil biology in that soil. And so we can bring that about with cover crops and making sure that we have good soil amendments that are going to support the growth and development of the microbes there.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. So when we start to take some action here, I think I know the answer to the question is probably it depends and it varies, but can people expect when this is such a human question to ask, when can we get results? Are we looking at, I know it's a process, but will we maybe start to see results the next year? Is this a 5-year thing? Is this a 10-year thing? What do you usually see as kind of a ballpark?
Right. Yeah. Well, again, like you said, it depends, but people can see results the very first growing season. And yeah, I definitely think that making changes in the soil can yield results the very first year. And it's going to take some time. I mentioned a 68% base saturation percentage for calcium. For most soils, we would also want to see magnesium at about 12%. And I have seen soils that when I first get to them, they're like 38%. It's like, it should be 12, but it's like almost 3 times what it should be. And that can take a long time to get it to come back down into balance. But one farm I'm thinking of right now, a produce grower, his started out at about 36%. And 5 years ago that was, and now he's at about 22%. Well, that's still about double the amount of magnesium that should be there, but it's way better than it was before. And so a lot of things start to turn around in the way your plants behave when you can change the soil structure like that. It just takes time.
Would you say it takes more time to reduce a nutrient than to build one up potentially?
Yes.
So that's the tricky. Okay. And
Mm-hmm.
if we do have an abundance of something, is it a matter of just growing more year after year to use that nutrient up? Or can sometimes we bring another nutrient into the place or back into balance and that will help counteract the one that's in abundance?
Yeah, both of those. Yes.
Okay.
You can plant certain crops that maybe will mine out the excess mineral more quickly than other plants would. And also, since everything is, it's not just quantities of minerals that are important, but the balance of the minerals relative to each other. So, like if you needed to have more potassium in the soil, when you add, if all you did is add more potassium to the soil, the percentage of magnesium and copper and other cations would just start to drop because you added more potassium. And so the poundage of those other minerals wouldn't change, but the percentage would change. So you can add other minerals to kind of shift the balance in your favor. So that, to me, that's the beauty of a soil test, is it gives an agronomist or a soil consultant so much information to be able to narrow in on what the best path is for the garden or the field.
Absolutely. Yeah. So start with that data. It is really valuable. And I felt that so much with my own soil tests. For years, I thought I was needing nitrogen. I was like more. And then when I finally got the soil test, I realized I was way too much nitrogen. So that there's some stuff you just won't know till you get that data. And it's super valuable. Yeah.
And just a quick note on nitrogen. One of the things that excess nitrogen does is it kind of burns up your calcium too.
Yeah.
So you can start to have problems like blossom end rot and things like that. That you think, oh, I don't have enough calcium. Well, maybe you did have enough, but you burned it up with too much nitrogen.
That every time I see those connections, and I'm still just a baby in understanding it all, but like the connections like that you just said, it just blows my mind. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much more going on here. We've reduced it down and dumbed it down to our detriment. There's just so much happening. It's mind blowing, but also it makes me fascinated. It's almost like makes me feel like reassured that there's just bigger things out there and we're just a little piece. And I don't know, that's comforting for me in a weird way. That there's it's bigger and more complex than our little human brains can grasp, and that's okay. That's a good thing. And it's fun to try to find our place in all of that. Yeah. Ooh, Gregg, I feel like we could talk for a long time. There's a lot of ground here to cover. We've covered a lot. Have I missed anything, or is there any other words of advice or wisdom you want to give to home gardeners or homesteaders listening? Any holes I have left here in our conversation? I mean, lots of them, but any big ones?
Well, I guess just driving the point home that there's so much that depends on the health of the soil. And two-time Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Linus Pauling, he said one time that every disease, every illness can be traced back to a mineral deficiency. And so to me, when I just think of how deficient, I guess, the things that we eat today are, it just seems really, really important that even for just our own families out of our own gardens, that we pay attention to the health of the soil. And on a bigger scale, I really encourage farmers to realize that they're not just growing food to earn money. They're growing food to feed people and to make people healthy and well and strong. And our very society, our country, the world depends on us producing good, high quality food. And there just isn't much of that around anymore. And actually, that's something that I can make available to your listeners too, is on my website, wisconsinmineralsolutions.com. Right on the front of the screen, I have a little button that they can click that says, I think it's the 5 questions for good food. And I made a little infographic that has 5 key questions that you can ask your farmer's market grower, or you can ask yourself in the way that you're gardening, in order to produce healthier soil and healthier food. What kind of questions can you ask yourself and ask other people that might be growing your food? So I'd encourage people to grab that. It's free on the website.
Awesome. So wisconsinmineralsolutions.com. Go check that out, guys. And it's so valuable because it's, I never want to discourage people. And I think anyone who's trying to think outside of the industrial food paradigm, get away from the grocery store in a sense, it's always good. It's always good. Like we always celebrate that. But I have heard, Joel Salatin has talked about, just because we are growing eggs or milk or vegetables on our homestead doesn't always mean the practices are better, because we're still sometimes stuck in that modern paradigm. So I think, pat yourself on the back if you're listening and you've started to ask the questions, you started the journey. That's awesome. Celebrate it. And then, keep asking yourself, how can I up level it? How can I make sure I'm not just copying industrial farming on a smaller scale? Right. Yeah. It's a great thought exercise, if nothing else.
Yep. That's awesome.
And do you have any products or services that, I know you go for those family farms or small farms, Do you ever consult with homesteaders or home gardeners?
I do, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. A lot of our farming customers refer their neighbors that are homesteading to get in touch with us.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Okay. So readers or readers/listeners could reach out on that regard as well if they
right. Yeah, they can connect to me through my website. So my Facebook account and things like that are all linked in there, and email.
Fabulous. Okay, good. We're gonna put that link in the show notes, guys, so you guys can go click over there. Well, Gregg, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on. I always love a good soil conversation.
Yeah.
I'm just starting to get the itch to get back outside. Here in Wyoming, we still have some snow, but I think I'm going to get out in the greenhouse this week and start cleaning it up and ready to roll. And this is a great Kickstarter for that. So thank you.
All right. Fantastic.